I'm going to not ask anything. I'm going to let you all get started with this because I know you have a lot of questions. I want to ask Denali a lot of questions about her film. So let's get started. I think the mics are ready.
Question to Sonia. I know that for Panther, music played a huge part of that. I wanted to know how you incorporated Muse into the social change movement.
Yes, it did. Certainly, we partnered with a lot of musicians and artists who talked about the role of music in creating the kind of cultural environment that creates space for political change. We also had like a relationship with Pandora, and they did a playlist, a Black Panthers playlist around the 50th anniversary. So, as much as possible, we would, lots of artists performed at the beginning of screenings as well.
Thank you. My question is for Denali. One, can you give us some background on the title of the movie? And then you spoke eloquently about power dynamics, exploitation, and tokenism. And I'm wondering, did you have this level of awareness at the start of your project, or did it evolve over the course of it? And how did you mitigate the inherent balance of power that comes with being a white female producer of a topic that primarily affects communities of color? Thank you.
Good questions. So the title is, I'm so glad you asked that question, because I love to talk about the title. It's not French, obviously. But so our working title, and brace yourselves, but was called Sons and Daughters of the Incarcerated. And yeah, well, that kind of leads into your second question too, about the process. Honestly, that title was because, that title came out of just my, cringing at sort of over-poeticizing people's stories that are just real life reality truths. So, of course, in our conversations and trying to figure out what the title was going to be, there was a lot of stuff that came into that was very poetic, but had very little to do with the actual story. So really it came down to, well, what has that essence that's just these boys for who they are, that isn't necessarily poetic and also isn't labeling them and siloing them within one identity and one issue. And at the end of the day, that really came down to their names. And we have gotten so much pushback on this title. I'm sure we haven't been signed with some people because of the title, because it's not that marketable, and no one knows what it's about, and people think it's a French film. But that was something that I really pushed back against, and became really important for me. And I brainstormed with the boys too on titles. And Mason, when I pitched this title for him, he was like, "No one will ever misspell my name again." It was so that's where the title came from, and I stand by it, even if people are like, "Très Mason." And they always want to rhyme it too. It's like Trey, Mason, Dason, But now you all know how to pronounce their names, and you know what their names are, and that's why the title exists. And then just briefly, no, to your second question. This was a process for me that started before I began the film, and I could go on and on, but I won't. But it really was a big challenge and a big thing for me to understand my role, not only in this specific instance of building a relationship with these boys, but my role as a filmmaker, my role as a white filmmaker, my role as a white person in this country, my family's history in this country, and all of the kind of heavy weight that comes with that is incredibly important. And so it really was a process of figuring. And so honestly, the way that I dealt with that is just to defer as much as I could. We were just playing and filming, and I had no specific agenda with the film. And the film doesn't even have a call to action or a hashtag or a truth that, I ultimately the filmmaker would imbue in something which is, appropriate when it is, but for this it wasn't. And this was really, the film therefore can speak to so many different things, and we've been talking to a lot of people recently about doing screenings specifically around fatherhood, and not necessarily incarcerated fatherhood, but just masculinity and growing up as a boy, and what a father's role in that is. And so it really exists in all of these different spaces, I think, because of that, just letting it develop and grow and be a product of that learning and of that process with the boys. So I hope that answers the question.
Hi, my name is Ione. I'm from POV on PBS. And this question is for Sonia. So I'm really interested in Firelight's work using films to bolster political movements. And I'm curious about your relationship with public broadcasting, because I know there's a heightened sensitivity to with public funding. There's the PBS mandate to be sort of apolitical, but of course, telling historical narratives always have politics embedded in them. So I'm wondering whether you've encountered pushback from the folks who are broadcasting, and if so, kind of how do you negotiate that, and how do you kind of advance a message, a social message, without and sort of stave off those accusations of like, oh, you're trying to, this is a political agenda, and you're biased. So how do you negotiate that?
We say that it does have a political agenda, and we're biased. No, I'm just kidding. I would say, we are just now, experimenting with having films on other platforms outside of public broadcasting, but public broadcasting has been really the home for all of Firelight's films over the last 19 years. And it's a home for us, the right home, because of, the accessibility to diverse audiences. But also because, these are mission-driven broadcasters, that commercial broadcasters don't have the same mission. So for the most part, when we're dealing with, whether it's, Independent Lens or American Experience, there is usually at least some level of a shared understanding about the importance of these narratives. How we use the narratives and how we talk about the narratives, there isn't always shared beliefs. And so we do know that there's a line that we can't cross. And the upside of working with a historical documentary, unlike contemporary social issue films, where there's a clear, oftentimes, call to action that would result in either direct organizing that would move into advocacy or legislative sort of work. There's many more potholes to navigate with a contemporary issue film. We have a lot of latitude with a historical film because we can always say this is simply about educating the public, which is why I say we have a public-facing campaign that the broadcasters can really get behind and add depth to, and then we have a less public-facing campaign, which is around movement building and connecting organizers of similar movements then and now. And that we don't have to lead with, and we can do lots of things privately that are hugely important to move this progressive work forward that we just simply don't have to put front and center. And I think that's our way around the work.
I'm like kind of just so inspired by this, so I'm gonna try to be fast. Denali, I think that you've got like a pedagogical approach here that's revolutionary, and I'm just curious if other people are taking it on, including like the buy-in that the subjects own part of the film. Sonia, like I'm just sort of, wait, am I getting your name wrong? Shoot, it's Sonia. Okay, good. Whew, that was gonna be embarrassing. Okay. I feel like this isn't the right question, but it's like you just inspired me on this sort of feeling about so much of, there's just so much spiritual and cultural technology in 4,000-year-old rituals to enact history, to enact stories. And so just 3 very quick examples, and I'm just curious what you think of this in relationship to making history come alive. I was talking with Baratunde Thurston, who's a good friend, last year, and he was talking about, and I'm Jewish, he was talking about his first Seder, Passover Seder, and saying, like, wouldn't that be amazing if the African American community had something that copied the Seder of "we were once slaves," and it was around a dinner table, and using that kind of cultural technology. Second would be, we have this segregation between Juneteenth, the Day of Independence, and July 4th, the Day of Independence, and they are 2 weeks apart from each other. And that's in Judaism, that's the high holidays. They're 2 weeks apart from each other, the 2 days. So what if there was a Days of Independence that connects this and creates a pregnant question of democracy and freedom not being something that is a static thing, but something that we have been striving for, make America great at last. And the third piece is the idea of a pilgrimage. We used to go on pilgrimages we still do, to Mecca, Vatican, Jerusalem, now to Disney World in the US. But what if we did a pilgrimage from the place of Emmett Till's death to the place of Emmett Till's birth, and reenacted the Great Migration as a kind of pilgrimage? So I'm just trying to think about how we can employ and tap into cultural and spiritual technologies of pilgrimage and breaking bread to take some of the history that you're bringing so brilliantly and bring it to life. Thanks. I'm going to catch my breath now. Thank you.
You're hired. I mean, so I'd love to talk to you like offline, because there's a lot that you that I think is fodder for conversation. I will say that our next film is a look at the transatlantic slave trade, and specifically about the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. So not the experience, it's not slave narratives or narratives of the enslaved, but rather the rise of commerce in trafficking of Africans, and how that commerce built essentially the capitalist system in Europe and in North America. And so we'll be, it's a historical film. We'll be tracing money. Certainly there are conversations to be had today about reparations that it will seed. But I think what's important is that it's going to be deep in archival material, in maps, in ledgers, again, unsexy archival material. But there's an opportunity there to use AR and VR to connect African Americans in particular to not just slave sites, because we don't always just want to access moments of points of pain, but for us to be able to think about emerging technologies as ways to map money, to map hugely important sites of both resistance and struggle that are difficult to access physically for African Americans. And so I do think that idea of pilgrimages and how we mark these places is a really interesting place for AR and VR to step in and think about how to bring some of these emerging technologies to pull the strings further on some of these important histories. So I think you're raising a lot of really great ideas that we've been thinking about as well for our next film. And I really would love to talk to you afterwards.
Hi, Prentice. I think you already kind of answered this question, but I'm going to ask it just to get clarity. As someone who's been in many of the movements that you're talking about, OSAs and Freedom Side and Help Birth Movement for Black Lives and those different moments, the thing that came to me to see the connection between these films and these movements being birthed, that they've helped aid these movements in historical context of how to move forward. So part of the question I have is how, I'm wondering and curious about, have you all, or you thought about, how do you convene conversations with activists and organizers and movements to unearth what's happening with them right now, to decide what histories could really serve them right now? Like what stories, because there's so many histories that can be told, but like seeing what's happening in the contemporary and trying to figure out what history could really serve them to make sense of the contemporary moment.
That's a great question, Prentice. So Kara mentioned a group of convenings that we've started to hold, and that is these kind of narrative convenings with groups of movement organizers of color from across a number of movements, and filmmakers of color who've been working on particular social justice issues. and have some closed-door conversations with them to talk first about the specific and unique role of narrative film, nonfiction, in supporting movement work. And to think about, it really occupies a unique role because, again, a lot of movement organizers, especially, there's some education that needs to happen around comms strategy versus narratives and the power of letting filmmakers and artists do what they do best as opposed to just serve communication strategy. But understanding that communication strategy is a hugely important part of organizing, and a lot of what you're trying to do is envision what is not currently there. Like you are trying to move a group of people to a new way of being and existing in this country. And nonfiction is not good in that role necessarily, right? You can't document something that isn't true. But there is a really particular role that nonfiction can play, and a lot of it is in documenting and dissecting movements, if there's really strong archival or the voices of living witnesses or actors in that kind of history. And so we did talk to this group of organizers, and we've started to have these conversations about what specific narratives could be told best through nonfiction that would support your movements in this current political climate, like within, and not necessarily long fiction, also potentially shorts, while we are under this current administration, like what rapid response nonfiction product can we push out really quickly that you all could use to make intersections across social justice movements and communities of color? And then what long-form films can we make that would shift a conversation over the next 5 and 10 years? So we have started those conversations. And I think, dissecting certain pieces of history is a really important role that nonfiction can play, but not the only one. I'd love to talk to you more about that, Prentice, because you should be in that room.
Hello, thanks everyone for your comments on that wonderful panel. My name is Courtney Cogburn. I'm a professor at the Columbia School of Social Work, and I also co-direct a newly formed emerging center around emerging technologies, media, and social work. A lot of people misunderstand what social work is, but if you take those words literally, that's what we do. And so I see a lot of opportunities for intersections. And as I'm here, I have the privilege to be in rooms like this. I learn so much from the knowledge that's shared from people who work in media and film, et cetera. I wonder if you have any recommendations for pedagogy around people who have been doing this work. So we've referenced a few different types of resource guides over the past couple of days. I wonder if you this might be a longer response, but if there are resources that you could direct me to as I think about how to train social workers to engage in this type of space. The second, Sonia, is I actually was recently funded to develop a project around structural racism using data visualization in virtual reality. I want to talk to you. Yes, so. And I think, and I was just writing like, oh, I need a historian, I need a journalist, and I need a filmmaker, right? So I'd love to speak with you more about possible intersections there.
That's all you, Brenda.
So we have repeated the really incredibly comprehensive field guide, that a new issue, that the impact guide that Doc Society will be releasing, which has embedded in it a lot of other case studies as well. Stories of Change is about to start releasing a set of materials about that relationship between social entrepreneurs and filmmakers. There's more material on that embedded in some of the in Making a New Reality as well. Also, I mean, our hosts have an incredible number here of case studies. I mean, and I would actually say to you, I think we all would really benefit and appreciate from nuanced, sensitive, rooted kind of cultural indicators, thinking about this work back into our own work. I think what we're hearing is the call for it, the need for it, and then the response is often, I think Jamie said this earlier, it often is, well, it depends, it's customized, right? The legal support question that came up earlier, Safe and Secure is a guide, but I've always been quite nervous having, made films that CIA isn't happy about, NSA isn't happy about, that, that's a very particular thing as well, right? Media law, but I would say, so we need more of it. There is actually quite a bit out there. Helicon and others have been mentioned, but I think I think we clearly need more, but I would talk to the people who've done it. To me, that's always learning, you know, and I think all of us would be happily connect you.
Hi, my name is Tianel Urdaneta. I'm a producer and director, and I feel so validated when I hear you, Sonia, talking about historical documentaries, because I have been working on a documentary about a group of Polish scouts that were part of the resistance during the Second World War in Poland. And it was a movement that involved thousands of scouts that risked their life just, you know, trying to fight against the Germans when they were in Poland. They were doing sabotage. They were the messengers. They were taking weapons out from the cemeteries that were initially buried by the adults. And in 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, they fought, and some were killed, some were sent to concentration camps. So I think my film has all the elements you were describing about the African American experience. There were social movements that involve children, that involve so many aspects that, for me, are amazing for an impact. What it means for children to be involved in conflicts, how those social movements created. My biggest frustration is that most of the campaigns are done about contemporary issues. First. And second, my audience is relatively small, you know, Polish Americans or Polish diaspora all over the world. But I feel that there is so many all those elements that people could benefit from that. And I'm completely lost about which organizations, where to go, so people can support this kind of historical documentaries that are not really based in the US, but have all those elements that could inspire people.
I hear you. Can I just shout out Just Vision?
Just Vision, yeah.
Just Vision. Where are you,
Sahad?
Just Vision? You should get on the mic and just
Give her the mic.
share out, if you haven't already, the work of Just Vision.
Good call.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. So many titans in the fields. My name is Sahad Baba. I'm with a team called Just Vision, and we're a team that researches, documents, and disseminates the stories of Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders who are working to end the occupation and build justice, freedom, and dignity in the region. We do this through documentary film, through impact campaigns around those documentary films, Hebrew language news sites that are dedicated to an intersectional approach on human and civil rights issues that would be otherwise ignored in the mainstream media in Israel and beyond. We've had the chance to partner with incredible people in this room, Doc Society, Sundance, Jamie Doby, Pieces Loud, Fork Films, Ford Foundation over the years. Katie has been just a powerhouse for us. So it's really incredible to be here with all of you, and amazing to be thinking about these questions around how do we, Sonia, it's really wonderful to hear you. We're currently out with a film called Nyland the Uprising, which is historical in nature. It's a documentary that documents the story of the Palestinian women who led the underground resistance movement during the First Intifada. And so this conversation is very resonant to me, but thank you for the shout out. It's really, really good to be here.
Hi, I'm Nona Ogunsula, and I have a question for the panel. Along the lines of target audience, for your films, who did you envision as the target audience? And then secondly, for Brenda, how does that get expanded maybe when someone like you gets involved?
I can jump in really fast with that, which only because I didn't get to it in my talk earlier. 10 minutes goes by super quickly. When you're up there, not necessarily when you're. So our process of finding targeted audiences followed a similar process of that the film took itself. So it's really obviously we have a lot of issues in this country with mass incarceration. Children and families and the collateral effects of a person's incarceration are not often in those conversations, particularly those voices of children who have been affected. That being said, there are also, none of the parents in the film are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, so it really isn't necessarily a film that fits into the narrative that we often hear about mass incarceration and wrongful convictions. And obviously, it fits within that in that there are a lot of structural issues that have people end up committing violent crimes. But it really is focused on the children and their experiences and the importance of child-parent relationships and visiting when a parent goes to prison. So that was something that I really learned through that process. And so in finding target audiences, one of our target audiences is really how do we bring kids and families together when they're separated by massive distances, when they're separated by glass and they don't have visiting hours like you might see in the film, where they can touch and hug and play games and roll around on wrestling mats, but kids are actually visiting their parent behind glass through a phone or are sitting across from them but aren't allowed to touch them. And so one thing that we're doing around the broadcast, because the broadcast is available and we can work with prisons to screen the film, we're calling National Visiting Days. So it's the 2-week broadcast period. We're working around the country with organizations and prisons to host simultaneous watching events so that kids and families can know that they're watching the film at the same time that their parent in prison is watching the film. And we're working with ITVS around technologies that we might be able to bridge those conversations and communications as well. So like the OV platform, and if anyone is aware of others, we're really looking into that now because we want to kind of be able to expand this past the broadcast. But just as a couple examples, so we've been working with the LA County Sheriff's Office. They're going to be broadcasting the film in all 12 of their jails across LA County, and then we're working with Friends Outside in LA to host these family screenings at the same time. And then we're also working in, we have partners doing similar things in other parts of California, Montana, Louisiana, Rhode Island, New York, and other states. So that's just one of our target audiences. We've also found with the film that people react to it in different ways and get different things out of it. So for incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people, it's really offers a chance to share their stories and really reflect and almost becomes therapeutic. So it's not necessarily a conversation around the system, it's really becomes a personal reflection and storytelling moment. For kids, and we've won now, I think, 4 Best Documentary Feature awards by youth juries, so it's really a film that resonates very strongly with youth. And for kids, it really allows them an experience of, and empowers them to speak to adults in their lives, particularly in and around how the kids in the film speak and communicate and interact with their parents and how their parents speak back. And so that's really what we're focusing on with our youth audiences is empowering dialogue, empowering them to feel empowered with their voices and be able to speak to people in their lives that are stakeholders in how they're able to, to find their own successes. So that's there's more, but I won't say more. Okay, thanks.
First of all, I would say I'm thrilled that you raised that question because I agree with what was said on, I think, the earlier discussion. Maybe it was Jamie or Molly talking about the specificity of audience. So the I want everybody to see my film answer as a producer was kind of like that's, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So I think it's a deep and very meaningful question. I want to be able to answer specifically about Sundance, or do you mean kind of about impact engagement strategy or festivals, or what was the link for you kind of about that when somebody like Sundance gets involved?
So usually a person has an idea of who they want to see the film, but that may get expanded, or it may get kind of shrunk in the sense of when they start thinking about the impact. And I don't know that a lot of people have that, initially when they're thinking about the target audience. So not necessarily, I'm thinking more in general.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear others, and there's some people in this room who are super savvy and have a lot of experience about that. I mean, I think one is it's really good to do all the kinds of planning and work where you're thinking about who might be interested in this film and kind of thinking perpendicular. And it's not just for film, right? This is for all of our work, right? I think the Midwest Cultural Lab really pointed this out, of like thinking deeply about who am I speaking to and who might want to hear that and who's representing. So it's not just so much for film. One thing I will say about nonfiction, though, is because we if you weren't on the public broadcasting system in the United States or in Europe or other countries, you really had to hustle to get your audience. A lot of nonfiction people are really good at this. They have a history of kind of being very nimble about finding their audiences in a way that a lot of fiction is now catching up to. So very specifically, there are very specific people who are really smart now about thinking about educational rights and OTT and streaming and YouTube and kind of piecing that together. We have a creative distribution initiative that's pretty broadly available now that's providing actually a lot of resources. It's a little different question than people have asked, but those resources that are available about distribution, to me, are some of the most important ones for the work that we're doing. But the other thing I would say is I think sometimes when you have a sense before, but then when you release your material, there are surprises, right? I don't know if other people have had this in a room where you're surprised or you think you're trying to go for a particular audience and then you find that they're not there or they live somewhere else. I remember with Dirty Wars, which we made kind of at the height of the popularity of the Obama administration, and it was a film that was quite critical of the foreign policy at the time, particularly the drone-embedded CIA-run targeted assassination programs. We were very interested in sort of Muslim and Arab American and communities in the United States at the time when they were under massive surveillance and targeting. So our theatrical release strategy was pretty useless for accessing people who were not going to come together to go out and see a film like that. That was the setup. So we had to find other ways of reaching that audience that was important to us. So I think there's a nimbleness too, which is a very complicated question too about distribution rights, but one that I literally love talking about it, so I will talk to you all day and all night about it offline. It's like one of my favorite. That and like budgets, I really like to talk about.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think we have time for one more question, but we still have time together, so you can find them. Is it you?
There's a lot of weight, I guess, to this. Thank you all so much. Still working on trying to figure out the right language around a lot of this impact conversation, so forgive me in advance. I guess this is mostly a question for Denali, but I think there may be some overlap. Are there times in the constructing of the film that a conversation about what the impact that you want the film to have has shifted the actual content or or maybe just from an editing standpoint, or even in a production standpoint when you're still shooting? Are there times where you've already been thinking about the impact and then changed the way that you've made the film? And you've already kind of talked about this, and I suppose it's more in post-production that I'm maybe aiming this question about, if this is my goal, then these are the things that I'm going to include or not going to include.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it comes back to, I mean, with our process, that determining that goal and determining that impact was not my job at the beginning, because it wasn't my experience, and I honestly knew very little about the criminal justice system when I began the film. And so what I set out to do was just work with the boys to share their experiences. And in that, I love the question, because I think that a lot of times, if you're driven by an impact, or if you're driven by a market, or you're driven by what's popular or what people want to see, a la my title, you you end up either perpetuating harmful narratives because these boys are not defined by their parents' incarceration, and I didn't want to make a film that made it look like they're suffering so much because their parents are incarcerated. And what they taught me is that, they had these incredible bonds and relationships despite the incarceration. And also that, they don't go home every night and cry themselves to sleep because their parents are in prison. They have their own lives, they have these other things. And so when you watch the film, you really see all of that nuance and complexity and life unfolding, And so there are scenes in the lunch cafeteria where Mason is talking about an egg that he disintegrated in hot sauce, and there are scenes with Dasan where he's vacuuming his room. And even, Dasan's mom's parole officer comes and visits the home after she's released, and, we intentionally really edited around Dasan's truth in that moment. So yes, that might have been a learning moment for people to really push in, oh, here's the process of parole, and this is what people go through when they're coming out of prison. But that wasn't the goal of the film. The goal of the film was to show Dasan's experience with that. And he was watching Spider-Man videos on his laptop at the time, in the same room. But so you're kind of hearing just, his mom and the parole officer talking, but you're seeing Dasan dance on listening to his headphones and watching Spider-Man videos, and that was his truth and his reality in that moment. And so it would not have been right to exploit that moment in another way, to say, okay, this is a teaching moment for, honestly, probably mostly white film festival audiences, to say this is what parole is like for folks like this. And that wasn't the agenda. There is no agenda. The agenda was to have these boys share their own truths in how they experience them. So, and some of that came, that was a process through production and then through the edit as well. And I think it helped that we didn't, explicitly, and this is just my process. So of course it's going to be different if you're really making a film about an issue that is happening right now, or you have something that's, but that kind of dignity and equality and dismantling of hierarchy, in that I would know what the agenda is and be the one to set that was the antithesis of what we were really working with the boys to do. So
I want to invite you all to do any final closing thoughts that you want to add, and then I'm going to move us forward. Yeah.
I kind of was thinking about the model that you created with the production, and what I really like about your thinking around impact, and it seems like being really responsive to what was interesting and important about this process of being documented for the boys themselves. And privileging that and responding to that is really important. And I think a lot about what the responsibility is of documentary producers to respond to the desires of protagonists around what they want from the experience of having their lives not only being documented, but shaped in an edit room and then shared with the public. And, Twiggy Pucci Garçon, who's, the protagonist and impact producer for a film called Kiki, and I have been thinking a lot about trauma-informed care principles that can be applied for protagonists who might re-experience trauma in the watching of their film during the release of the film at festivals with foreign audiences, and what the process is like, what the experience is like for folks to have their lives documented, and how infrequent it is for protagonists, whether they are just little boys, not just, but little boys, or they are organizers, and what is the responsibility of documentary filmmakers and impact producers to involve those protagonists in the shaping of the release of the film. And also to ask questions like, what is it that you want to get out of this experience? Is it a new skill? Is it, And what do you want to get out of the experience of telling your story? Not just like skills, and I want to travel, it could be that. But it also could be, I want to work through my own issues, and some people can articulate that, and other people can't. But anyway, I think it raises this question about our field's responsibility to the people whose lives they're opening up for us, and what that experience really feels like for folks who are at the center of these films, and how we should be engaging them.
And as a just quick example, because I love that, and I think, so for Trey, and I'm, very close and in touch with all of the boys still, in different ways, again, because they're at different places, but and Trey loves the film. I showed it to him the first time. He was in a group home at the time, and so we watched it together there, and he Snapchatted out the end, and I was like, whew, thank God. But he came and has spoken to audiences and really is, incredibly reflective and can speak about the film. But then he stopped coming, and for a while I was worried that it was I just wanted to know what he was feeling and why he wasn't coming to these screenings. But then I asked him. We were in San Francisco screening the film at the Juvenile Justice Center there, and the girls at the Juvenile Justice Center were like, can we talk to Trey? We want to Skype Trey. And I was like, so I just FaceTimed him and I was like, hey, I'm at this place. Do you want to talk? And he had the best time and just was so engaged with them. And I realized in that moment, Trey doesn't care to speak to film festival audiences. That's not how, and honestly, yeah. And I always am wait,
what are you saying about film festival audiences?
There is inevitably a literal line of older white women giving Trey hugs at these festivals, and it's no freaking wonder, right? And yeah. And all of them are conscious about it. They're I'm just another white woman coming to give you a hug. I'm if you know, then stay in your seat. Anyways.
Stop hugging. No hugs.
So I, that, it opened my eyes just in that moment of hearing and watching him engage with these girls, that were serving time at the Juvenile Justice Center, and I realized, this is how Trey can engage and wants to engage. And so, we're, now that I know, and it's not as easy as just asking him, they don't necessarily know, and so we can, engage them all in the ways that are most comfortable. Meanwhile, and when you see the film, Mason has no problem. He's my go-to for press and everything else because he is right out in front. So, yeah.
One thing, and I know you have to go over, but it may be that we're answering some of the question that I had raised and others, and you've clearly posed by, once again, your brilliant curation of people have talked about transformative and not transactional and kind of not extractive, but additive, or the way that Color of Change talked about not just challenging negative narratives that exist, but bringing in new ones that don't. And it may be that ethical core, that question for both our protagonists, and also I would say having worked with antagonists, many of the people I've, it's not just about the poor people, nice people behind the camera, but in front of the camera, who obviously take their greatest risks being there. But I think that may be part of the connection between yesterday's conversation and today, of how to do that in a holistic and building way. So again, well done, Katie and Varsha. How do we care for antagonists? I've felt that with Julian Assange, so I come back to that question.
Well, I would like to thank our panel, our speakers. Thank you all so much. Amazing.